Welcome to part 2 of my video on how I created a Dungeons & Dragons campaign set in the world of the Elder Scrolls series, making extensive use of house rules and homebrew content created by myself to more closely replicate the feel and mechanics of the video games in a tabletop game. If you haven't seen part 1, go ahead and watch that if you want. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified when part 3 comes out. Now, on to the video. Now, this is probably where most of my homebrew effort was focused. I'm sure everyone who's played an Elder Scrolls game knows of the main races in the game, but for those who aren't familiar, they are Altmer, Argonian, Bosmer, Breton, Dunmer, Imperial, Khajiit, Nords, Orcs, and Redguards. There are a lot of other intelligent creatures that exist in the Elder Scrolls universe, such as goblins, snow elves, minotaurs, slodes, imgas, and so forth. But these are the only ones you can actually play in any of the games. The simplest and easiest approach to duplicating these races is to simply reskin the existing D&D races, and this is largely the way most people I've seen have gone about this. Argonians are lizard folk, Nords are Goliath, Khajiit are Tabaxi, or maybe Leonin if you choose to be a Pamar or Sench. Humans are just humans, elves are just elves, etc. Dark elves are a bit tricky since they don't really have anything in common with D&D's drow other than having gray skin and worshipping demons. I would probably just substitute drow for tieflings since they have fire resistance and just replace their innate spellcasting with the ability to summon a specter once a day or something similar. The other approach, and the one I used in my campaign, is to actually create entirely new races that are more true to the ones in the game. For example, 90% of the races in D&D have dark vision, but in the Elder Scrolls, the Khajiit are the only ones who get this by default. So, I went through the various depictions of the Tez races throughout the games in which they've appeared, and compiled the features that appear most often. The various racial features were pretty consistent overall, although Skyrim did throw a wrench in this a bit by taking out a lot of classical racial traits and adding in ones that have never appeared before. Since my campaign, like I said, was set during the Third Era, I leaned most heavily toward races as they were depicted in Morrowind and Oblivion. As such, here are some of the things I noticed remained more or less consistent. High Elves are immune to paralysis, have resistance to diseases, and get more starting magicka, but are weak against magic damage. In D&D terms, that translates to advantage on saving throws against disease, a +2 bonus to magicka maximum per level, and I also gave them a bonus cantrip to represent their lore-friendly affinity for magic. Now, elemental weakness is a big balancing factor for this race, and there's a few different ways you could do it, depending on how harsh you want to be, as well as simplicity. I originally had this as simply Altmer take an extra die of fire, frost, and shock damage. This worked, but ultimately I decided it was a bit too lenient, especially since it's so easy to get resistance to those damage types in 5e. You could also just give them disadvantage on saving throws against magic or straight up vulnerability to elemental damage. Both of these approaches are simple, but also might be a bit too harsh. What I settled on is you just take 50% more damage from fire, frost, and shock. So if you're hit by a fireball for 20 damage, you actually take 30 instead, and so on. This requires a bit more math, yeah, but I figured it was the most fair and balanced approach for my game. Argonians are easy. They just get a swim speed, immunity to poison and disease, they can breathe underwater, and I gave them natural weapons. Boom. Done. I decided to make Skyrim's hissed skin power into a racial feat, but you can probably add that to the base race if you think they're a bit underpowered in your game. Bosmer have remained fairly consistent. They have advantage on saving throws against disease, and they can talk to animals. They don't really have much else going on. So to make them a bit more competitive with the other races, I decided to incorporate their racial power from Skyrim. My Wood Elves can cast Animal Friendship and Summon Beast once per day. Note, this is Summon Beast, not Conjure Animals. It is very important to make that distinction. Bretons are very consistent across games too. They get magic resistance and also enhanced magicka, so they gave them advantage on saves against magic, essentially the magic resistance trait, and 1 extra point of magic at every other level. So 1, 3, 5, 7, so on and so forth. They also get their daily racial power Dragon Skin, which gives them a +2 to AC and spell absorption for 1 minute. Dunmer get fire resistance, as mentioned before, and I decided to give them a choice between Ancestral Guardian and Ancestor's Wrath. Since they don't really have that many racial traits, I also decided to throw in Shadowed Path from one of those phone games nobody's played. For Imperials, they get Star of the West and Voice of the Emperor. I also threw in Imperial Luck from Skyrim, since I often roll dice to determine how much gold the party finds in chests and such. Khajiit get Cat's Claws from the Tabaxi, along with Dark Vision, and they can cast the Cause Sphere spell once per day. I also threw in the Warm Fur and Raw Diet perks from Skyrim Survival Mode just for the hell of it, included under one trait called Feline Resilience. Oh, and instead of bothering with a dozen different subraces to represent the various fur stocks, I just took a cue from the more recent D&D races and just let the player choose whether their Khajiit is medium or small size. I also introduced a racial feat for the Rot versions, which give them the powerful build trait and a few other benefits of their improved stature. For Nords, I gave them cold resistance, Mountainborn from the Goliath, and the Woad ability, which gives them resistance to weapon damage for 1 minute once a day. In addition, they can cast Frost Touch and Fear once a day each. Incidentally, I'm using the updated language on racial spellcasting in D&D, so all of these spells are added to your list as well, if you happen to be a spellcaster. Orcs and Redguards are mechanically very similar. Both get a once a day, 1 minute, I wreck your encounter racial power, and one other feature. For Orcs, this is magic resistance, and for Redguards, this is advantage on saves versus disease and poison. This might seem like the Orc is a better option, but Adrenaline Rush doesn't make you grant advantage to all attackers, whereas Berserker Frenzy does, so... Oh, I forgot to mention that I'm using the new rules for races that Tasha's Cauldron introduced. That's why I didn't mention skills or ability scores. In my game, all races get a +2, +1, or +3 to 3 stats, and they get to pick 2 skill proficiencies and 2 languages. They can also trade skill proficiencies for tools, weapons, and so forth. And I also give them bonus languages for having a high intelligence modifier. To help compensate a bit for the MAD introduced by the tweaks to the magic system, I also give my players 30 points to spend on point buy, and an extra feat at first level, except that it has to be a racial feat. Now on to character classes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, as you don't really even need to bother making your own subclasses, really. I just did it because I like to make up homebrew content, and because I can then control F all the proper nouns, replace them with Forgotten Realms things, and sell them on the DM's Guild, link in the description. But seriously, there's enough archetypes published for 5e right now that you can very easily just run an Elder Scrolls game as is. That's not even taking into account all of the third-party material you can find that adds subclasses and other optional stuff to the game. Like my class archetype collection, available now on the... Sorry, no more shameless plugs for now, but yeah. Anyway, I did go ahead and make a subclass for every class in the game other than Artificer, since that wasn't released officially at the time. In general, the archetypes I made were focused on plugging thematic holes in the vanilla game, like the Oath of Aetherius for a Paladin of Julianos, or the Deceiver Patron for a Warlock that serves Mythala, or the Wizard Tradition of Restoration. The others were just experimenting with cool ideas I had, like a Daedra Spawn Sorcerer, or the Tribal Champion Barbarian, or the Circle of the Atronak Druid. Just as a quick example of my process, I'll detail one of the subclasses that I made, the Way of the Voice Monk. This ascetic warrior was trained in the ancient halls of High Hrothgar, upon the throat of the world, where Nords believe that kine created their race by breathing life into the snow. As a monk of the Way of the Voice, you have spent years learning the ancient language of the dragons from Skyrim's legendary greybeards, learning to take the meaning of the words into yourself and shape that understanding to produce a mighty Thu'um, the legendary power of the storm voice possessed by the Nord heroes of old. After years, or perhaps decades of arduous study, you have mastered enough of their teachings to use the power of the Thu'um in combat. What you choose to do with this power is now in your hands. At 3rd level, the Way of the Voice Monk gains the Words of Power feature. They learn Draconic if they didn't already know it, and you can now expend key points to use Dragon Shouts. Since the character is not assumed to be Dragonborn, they can learn only 6 Dragon Shouts over the course of their career, 3 at 3rd level, 1 more at levels 6, 11, and 17. Also, they initially can only invoke 1 word of each shout they know, and must gain additional levels in the Monk class to learn more words. I included most of the Dragon Shouts from Skyrim into this class, except for things that wouldn't make a lot of sense to include for lore reasons, such as Dragon Rend or Soul Tear, although you might include this as a quest reward if the player somehow enters the Soul Cairn and encounters Durnavir. A lot of these shouts, such as Fire Breath or Cyclone, just duplicate the effect of spells, whereas others, like Aura Whisper or Elemental Fury, have their own unique effects. Sort of like the Way of the Four Elements, except not hot garbage. Unlike the Four Elements Monk, the Way of the Voice Monk actually gets other class features. Crazy, I know. Specifically, at 6th level, they gain Voice of the Wind, which grants proficiency in Intimidation or Persuasion, and expertise on ability checks using either skill. At 11th level, they get Draconic Fortitude, which grants them advantage on saving throws against other Dragon Shouts, as well as spells duplicated by Dragon Shouts that they know. Also, they don't take damage on a successful save and only half if they fail, so it's kind of like evasion for Dragon Shouts. Finally, at level 17, they get And the Universe Listens. They gain immunity to thunder damage and the Deafened condition, and they can spend 2 extra key points to use the Thuum as a bonus action. And they get the ability to basically use a dragon's frightful presence, proficiency bonus times a day, except it also grants them advantage on intimidation checks. Oh, they also gain the ability to use 2 words of a shout at 7th level and all 3 words at 11th level. The key point cost of a shout equals the number of words. I have a player in my game who is playing this class, and he's having a ball with it, especially back when I had Battle Fury last for a minute at rank 1 and have a radius of 30 feet. It gave every single member of the party a bonus action attack every round. This was a mistake. In general, I did have to go back and tweak a few of these shouts after playtesting for a while, as naturally translating some of these effects to D&D wasn't always an obvious match. Although on the plus side, I did manage to make Animal Allegiance, Dismay, and Kind's Peace not utterly worthless. So there's that. The first 2 TES games gave each class specific advantages and disadvantages, which you couldn't change after character creation. This made each class feel unique, but had the side effect of locking off some gameplay options, most notably spellcasting, unless you wanted to start over with a new character each time. Starting in Morrowind, these were generalized to birth signs that any character could take regardless of which class they chose. In Oblivion, they added rune stones, which you could use to gain powers associated with the birth signs that you didn't pick, adding a bit more customizability. In Skyrim, birth signs were phased out entirely, allowing any character to choose whatever standing stone ability they felt was most useful at the time. Depending on the needs of your game, you could adapt one or all of these methods. When I was first developing my campaign, I initially had birth signs replace the characters' backgrounds. I assigned each birth sign 2 skills and an associated benefit based on their effects in Oblivion and Morrowind. This worked out okay, although obviously some of the birth signs, particularly the Apprentice and the Mage, ended up being much more attractive to my party than any of the others. When I was revising my rules more recently, I decided to take an idea from the Magic the Gathering campaign guides and just have birth signs be an extra layer that's added onto character creation. This results in more powerful PCs, obviously, but it also makes it a bit easier to balance the benefits against each other. Alternatively, you can go to the Skyrim route and just have standing stones in the world that characters can find to gain the benefits of birth signs. The added benefit of this approach is that you have more control over when and where the characters find these stones, so it's easier to prevent your party from getting too powerful in the earlier tiers when these powers would have the greatest effect. I did technically add standing stones to my game, but in practice my characters tend to dislike overworld exploration, so I never actually used the random encounter tables that would result in finding one of them. So if you think your party would have the same issue, then you might not prefer to use the runestone method. Backgrounds in general are a pretty easy thing to manage. Most of the ones in the game already are more or less compatible with an Elder Scrolls campaign. The only thing I added was a background for each of the major factions in Tamriel. You know, the Mages Guild, the Fighters Guild, Thieves Guild, Imperial Legion, Dark Brotherhood, the Great Houses of Morrowind, etc. This way a character could begin as part of that guild if they wanted to. The background benefits in this case is basically just being able to accept quests or get free supplies and lodging from the associated guild, provided you continue to pay the fee for membership when it's due. Which factions you decide to do this with depends a lot on the time and place you decide to set your campaign, as each individual province might have their own alternative to the Cyrodiilic guilds, like the Companions or House Telvanni. Also, if your game is set a significant time after the Oblivion Crisis, keep in mind that there canonically is no Imperial Mages Guild anymore. They were disbanded and replaced with two competing organizations, the Synod and the College of Whispers. Presumably, this also paves the way for other magical factions in the provinces to fill the power vacuum on a local level, since there's no longer a central authority imposing foreign leadership on their internal arcane traditions. So this would actually make fertile ground for you to make up your own factions of mages to compete over who gets to control the wizarding world of your chosen province. Shrine blessings are also not that difficult, but might require a bit more balancing. I allow my players to make offerings to the 9 divines or the Daedric princes in exchange for temporary divine boons along the lines of what you would find in the TES games. In order to prevent them from abusing the system too much, I require the players to make an offering that's worth at least 100 gold, and I only allow them to gain the blessing of one divinity at a time, and only once per day. Obviously, blessings from the same god also don't stack. One other thing I took from the MTG campaign books was the piety system from Theros. I completely overhauled the way Daedric artifacts work in my game after reading it, and now each player has an explicit piety score with each of the 8-in-1 divines and the 16-ish princes of Oblivion. Each artifact provides a few minor baseline benefits, which get progressively more powerful as the players do things that please the divinity associated with the artifact. This also helps to reconcile the sometimes wildly different power levels of certain artifacts as they appear in game. What? Volendrung, the frickin' Hammer of Might, after which an entire province of Tamriel is named, just has a bog-standard absorb stamina enchant? Well, that's because Malakath doesn't like you enough to give you access to the top shelf stuff. Maybe go kill a few Boethia cultists and he'll reconsider. That's it for part 2. Part 3 will be coming up as soon as I finish editing. If you've got any questions, suggestions, or anything else you'd like to say, go ahead and leave a comment down below. Links to my DM's Guild products and to part 1 of this video will be in the description. Thanks for watching. Good night.